It's the pitch-black night of September 1788. You're standing in the middle of a massive European army. We're talking 100,000 men strong, camped near a town in Romania. Suddenly, shots ring out. Men are screaming in the dark. Absolute chaos erupts. Bayonets flash and the entire army begins tearing itself apart in a brutal, bloody panic. Now, you'd probably assume they were under a massive surprise attack, right? Well, not exactly. And that brings us to the first story in our explainer today. It is a genuine question. How does an army of that size just lose a town before the enemy even gets there? So the Austrian army was camped out, scouting for Ottoman forces during the Austro-Turkish War. A group of their elite cavalry, the Hussars, crossed a river to do some reconnaissance. But instead of finding the fearsome Ottoman army, they stumbled upon a group of Romani people. And what exactly were these locals selling? Yeah, they bought cheap schnapps. This right here is where a minor, everyday logistical choice turns into absolute historical madness. The Hussars bought the barrels of schnapps and started drinking. Pretty soon, some of their own Austrian infantrymen crossed the river, saw the party, and demanded a sip. Well, the Hussars refused. An argument broke out, someone threw a punch, and suddenly you have a full-blown drunken brawl erupting between friendly forces. And it spirals completely out of control. The brawl escalates, and a shot is fired in the dark. A panicked soldier screams, "Turks! Turks!" thinking the enemy has finally arrived. The Hussars flee back to camp. The infantry runs after them. German officers, desperately trying to restore order, start yelling, "Halt! Halt!" But remember, the Austrian army was highly multinational. So the non-German speakers hear the shouting and think they are hearing the Ottoman war cry, "Allah! Allah!" The camp erupts into completely blind, terrified friendly fire. By the time the sun actually rose, the army had scattered to the winds, leaving behind an estimated 150 to up to 10,000 casualties. When the actual Ottoman army showed up days later, they found the town totally undefended and just walked right in. Literally, history's worst friendly fire incident started over cheap liquor. All right, let's move on to our next story. A longbow in WWII. Meet Mad Jack Churchill. So, from a staggering blunder, let's jump forward to the mid-20th century to look at one of the most eccentric military characters to ever live. Imagine fighting in World War II. It's the most highly mechanized, industrialized conflict in human history, right? Tanks, machine guns, heavy artillery. And into this metal storm steps a man fighting like he just walked out of the Middle Ages. Compare your standard kit on the left to the gear of John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill on the right, forever known as Mad Jack. This guy went into combat armed with a Scottish broadsword, his beloved bagpipes, and a modern Swedish steel longbow. And he actually used it. During the chaotic 1940 withdrawal to Dunkirk, Jack scored a confirmed kill on a German soldier using a hunting arrow. He was an intensely competitive archer before the war, and he brought that deadly precision straight to the modern front lines. But Mad Jack wasn't just a fierce fighter. He possessed a spectacularly bizarre kind of confidence. When he was a young officer at the prestigious Sandhurst Military Academy, he once showed up to a formal parade carrying an umbrella. When a furious superior officer demanded to know why he had it, Jack just looked at him and simply replied, "Because it's raining." He was a man utterly unbothered by convention. I mean, he was even the only Englishman to ever win a medal at a Scottish piping contest. Okay, shifting gears completely now, story number 3. Drowning the Dutch countryside, the Siege of Leiden, 1574. Let's leave the battlefields of WWII and travel way back to 1574. And we're gonna drop the humor for a second, because the situation facing the Dutch city of Leiden was incredibly grim. They were surrounded by the massive, seemingly invincible Spanish Habsburg army. And the Spanish didn't just want to defeat Leiden in combat. They wanted to starve it to death. 8,000. That is the number of citizens inside Leiden who died from starvation and the plague. This city had gone a full month without a single scrap of food. The suffering was just unimaginable, a true nightmare of medieval siege warfare. They were completely cut off, completely outgunned, and running out of time. But the Dutch had one ally the Spanish couldn't control: the water. In an act of sheer desperation and wild audacity, the Dutch resistance made a choice. They decided to break apart their own dikes. They intentionally flooded their own low-lying countryside, mile by agonizing mile. They ruined their own precious farmland, just so the Spanish army, who understandably had absolutely no desire to fight a war in a rising marsh, would be forced to retreat. And the absolute craziest part of this plan, it allowed the Dutch naval ships to literally sail inland, right over the submerged farms, to reach the city walls. If the wind hadn't shifted at the exact right moment, the water wouldn't have been deep enough and it all would have failed, but it worked. On October 3rd, 1574, those naval ships reached Leiden, delivering life-saving bread and herring to the starving survivors. It is a rescue so profoundly ingrained in their history that, to this day, the city of Leiden still hands out free bread and herring to its citizens every single October 3rd. All right, let's bring the energy back up for this next one. The Phantom Rubber Army, 1,100 men impersonating 30,000. We're heading back to the Second World War for a story that sounds straight out of a Hollywood comedy but actually saved thousands of lives. It's September 1944. General George S. Patton has a very dangerous hole in his line near Metz, France. So, to plug it, he sends in the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. This is a unit of just 1,100 men, and their task is to fool the Germans into believing they are the 30,000-strong 6th Armored Division. Look at the sheer artistry they used to pull this off. On the right, you see the actual soldiers of this unit, which heavily recruited art students, theater set designers, and even a future famous fashion designer named Bill Blass. On the left are their weapons, 93 pounds inflatable rubber Sherman tanks. This was the 603rd Engineer Camouflage Battalion, and their entire job was visual deception. From the air, these rubber dummies, complete with fake tread tracks bulldozed into the dirt, looked absolutely real to German reconnaissance planes. Now, working with rubber tanks definitely led to some deeply bizarre moments. During Operation Bettenberg, Corporal Arthur Shilstone was on guard duty when 2 French cyclists accidentally wandered past his post. They completely ignored him, just staring in absolute shock over his shoulder. Why? Because they were watching 4 American GIs casually pick up a 40-ton Sherman tank to turn it around. Shilstone obviously didn't want to blow the secret, so he just looked at the Frenchmen, shrugged, and said, "The Americans are very strong." But visual tricks were only part of the illusion. They had engineers from Bell Labs using state-of-the-art wire recorders to blast the sounds of moving armor out of massive speakers that could be heard 15 miles away. They had elite radio operators mimicking the exact telegraph styles of other, real units. They even used what they called atmospherics, which was basically method acting. To convince local spies they were a huge armored division, they sent a jeep into a town with a fake 2-star general. This general, who was actually just a major, marched right into a bar, confidently confiscated 6 cases of incredibly expensive cognac, and sped off. He knew for a fact that the furious bartender would immediately run and tattle to the Germans about the 6th Armored Division thieves operating in the area. And you know what? It worked perfectly. Okay, for our final story, we are dropping the humor completely. Sabotaging the Nazi nuke. Operation Gunnerside, 1943. The stakes here could not have been higher. We are talking about the most perilous, critical sabotage mission of World War II, the mission to stop Adolf Hitler from getting an atomic bomb. The crucial point here is understanding exactly why this one target mattered so much. The German nuclear program relied on heavy water to act as a neutron moderator in their reactors, and the only place in the world producing it on an industrial scale was a heavily fortified hydroelectric plant called Vemork, perched on a steep cliff in frozen, occupied Norway. It was the absolute bottleneck of the Nazi atomic dream. The Allies knew, without a doubt, they had to destroy it. But the path to Vemork was devastating, and the cost was unimaginably high. The first advance team of 4 Norwegians lived in brutal Arctic conditions for months, literally surviving by eating reindeer and moss. But the main assault, Operation Freshman, ended in total tragedy. 34 British Royal Engineers crashed their gliders in a severe storm. Every single one of them was either killed on impact or captured, tortured, and executed by the Gestapo. The Germans found their maps and heavily fortified the plant even more. But the Allies were undeterred. They sent in a new, tiny team of 9 elite Norwegian commandos led by a 23-year-old named Joachim Ronneberg. Their insane plan? To bypass the heavily guarded bridge by climbing down into a 200-meter-deep, freezing gorge, crossing a river, and scaling the sheer cliff face in pitch darkness. It was a route the Germans believed was completely impossible. 18. That was the number of heavy water electrolysis cells inside the basement of the plant. These commandos successfully scaled that impossible cliff, sneaked right past the guards, and bypassed the locked heavy steel doors by crawling through a tiny, claustrophobic cable duct. Working with terrifying precision, they wired every single one of those 18 cells with custom explosive charges set to exactly 30-second fuses. And here is the miraculous number of this whole operation. 0. 0 shots fired, 0 casualties on either side. The explosions shattered the cells, sending 500 kilograms of heavy water right down the floor drains, crippling the Nazi nuclear timeline in an instant. It was an absolute masterclass in precision sabotage. But they still had to get out. With 3,000 furious German troops hunting them across the frozen plateau, the core team strapped on their cross-country skis and skied an agonizing 400 kilometers across the most hostile terrain in Norway, all the way to neutral Sweden. And amazingly, every single one of them survived. Look at the sheer range of what we've covered in this explainer today. From the absolute Schnapsfield disaster of Karansebes to the unmatched, chilling bravery of the Wehrmacht saboteurs. Whether it's an Englishman wielding a medieval longbow in a modern war, a Dutch city drowning its own livelihood just to survive, or a bunch of artists armed with rubber tanks tricking a panzer division, history proves time and again that audacity and the unbreakable human spirit often rewrite the rules of war. So, I want to leave you with this question to ponder as we wrap up. Between the deadly friendly fire brawl, the guy charging into World War II with bagpipes and a sword, the drowned city, the fake rubber army, and the skiers who saved the world from a Nazi nuke, which of these impossible historical gambles shocked you the most? Keep digging into those history books because the truth is always wilder than fiction. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.